Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and also hello to everyone who is watching this online via the streaming. A first story. So earlier this summer, a dog walker discovered a pig with 10 piglets in the woods in Ollerton in Nottinghamshire in the United Kingdom. The pregnant pig had escaped from a nearby farm and given birth in the woods. She could not forage for food herself as she had a nose ring. But after negotiations with the farmer and much public pressure to not have them taken back to the farm and be killed eventually, she and her piglets were taken to a sanctuary where they can live for the rest of their life. So my presentation is about animal resistance and human saviorism. Now, animal rights activism often focuses on the plights of millions or billions of animals who are oppressed by humans, and other animals are used and exploited in so many ways for food, for entertainment, and in sports, for clothing, in scientific experiments. Their habitats are invaded or destroyed and changed, but what is less often focused on is the fact that these animals also very much resist that oppression. So I will be sharing some stories of animals who resist their oppression. I will also talk about human saviorism, what it is, how we can recognize it, and how putting the focus on stories of animal resistance on their own agency can help us go beyond a savior to being an ally in solidarity with other animals. Now, other animals resist in numerous ways, by escaping, by fleeing for freedom, by not cooperating, by refusing to perform, also by attacking their handlers, and even by retaliating, and many other acts of everyday resistance. And that while we make it very difficult for them to resist by enclosing them, by even disabling their bodies so that they can't fight back or that they can't fly away or run away, or by making them more docile, as is the case in the process of domestication. Another story that went viral in mainstream media was the story of the so-called cow hero in Poland. So this story happened in February 2018. And cows on a farm were being brought together and led to the truck that would drive them to the slaughterhouse. And one of the cows resisted fiercely and even broke the arm of one of the handlers and eventually escaped. So she rammed the fence of the farm and kept running, till at one point she reached the lake, so she couldn't run any further. But there she jumped into the water and she swam to the island in the lake. And in the following days, the farmer went to the island a couple of times and he tried to catch her, but he was unable to catch her. And he went back a couple of times and eventually just left food for her because he was unable to catch her. And the local fire department also went to try and catch her, but when she saw the boat approaching with the firefighters, she jumped into the water again and swam to the next peninsula. Meanwhile, this cow had gained international fame, and she was thus called the cow hero, as you can see in the screenshot from a newspaper article. But that photo was not really actually the cow hero. That was a stock photo that was taken. I have some photos of the actual cow in the next slide. So a local politician offered to spare cow hero from slaughter and offered sanctuary on his farm. So they went with a sort of rescue team to the island to try and catch her. And it took several hours of chasing her to catch her. And eventually she had to be sedated because she kept on running and she resisted. So she was sedated in that process. Here you can see actual photos of that cow after being sedated and ropes around her head, and in the process, one of her horns had also broken off. Now, the purpose was, it was meant to be that she was taken to the sanctuary, but unfortunately, she never made it to the sanctuary, as she died during transport. And it is believed that she may have died from a heart attack caused by the stress of the so-called rescue operation. So she managed to live for 4 weeks in freedom. Another story of animal resistance is from Borneo in Indonesia. Now, this is a screenshot from video footage from the organization International Animal Rescue. It shows an orangutan attacking a digger or a bulldozer in a logging operation in the forest in Borneo. Now, these images were shot in 2013 and they went viral in 2018, so I think a lot of you people will have seen this short clip, this video. And it went viral afterwards because it was used in the documentary from David Attenborough, Climate Change, The Facts. And in this video, you can see the orangutan walking across the logged tree and effectively slamming the bulldozer, hitting the bulldozer, and then falling off the tree and disappearing into the forest. So the footage of this resisting orangutan was able to bring attention to the issue of deforestation in the area and globally, worldwide, and the impact on the animals of the destruction of their habitat. Here's another story of animal resistance. This was Tatiana the tiger, and she was born in captivity in 2003 in the United States. So this incident happened in 2007 in San Francisco Zoo when she was 4 years old. So Tatiana at one point was able to jump over the ditch, over enclosure and the wall, and she attacked 3 men and also killed one of them, a 17-year-old, while the other 2 who were watching her, the 3 men visited the zoo together, the other 2 managed to run away and to escape. Now, Tatiana kept on walking through the zoo grounds, and while she was walking through the zoo grounds, she ignored many other zoo visitors and really was tracking down the other 2 men. What became apparent afterwards is that these men had been taunting her and reportedly also had been throwing things at her. She eventually found these 2 men at the zoo cafe, but at that point, she wanted to attack them, but at that point, the police had arrived at the zoo and they shot her and she was killed. Now, that story of Tatiana also sparked a lot of discussion about keeping wild animals on display in zoos. Now, about such stories of animal resistance, the animal industrial complex will most often frame such incidents as they are just occasional accidents, they are very rare, they are abnormal, they don't happen a lot. Or they will say it's animals that have gone crazy, insane, the animals have gone wild, and can also note that this has an ableist component as well, framing these animals as crazy, as insane. Or the animals were just following their instinct, denying them their agency, actually. Or they will say it was a fault in the design of the enclosure, it will be fixed and it will not happen again, or it was a fault of the handler, he was not professionally trained enough, so we will fix it, it won't happen again. But as we can see from the many stories that make the headlines, and next to these that make the headlines, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of other stories that don't make the news, that happen every day. So these incidents of animal resistance, they happen all the time. Now, after a tiger attack in a Russian circus, when asked whether they would kill the tiger, the trainer said, if we were to kill every tiger that attacks us, there wouldn't be any left. So with framing these stories as occasional accidents, the industry is really diverting attention away from the structural abuse and solitary confinement that animals have to endure day in, day out. And I think we, as activists, we should focus on changing the narrative around such incidents. When they happen, when they reach the mainstream media, we have the opportunity to seize that moment and to show the animals' agency. These are not stories of animals who have gone mad, but it's really normal behavior of animals showing us that they don't agree with their oppression, that they fight back. These are acts of rebellion against their oppression. We should bring the larger story into the picture, or try to do so. Their resistance doesn't come out of the blue. They are not occasional accidents, but they do have a prior history of abuse and exploitation. We should try to tell the story from the animal's point of view and not from the human's point of view. We also should be careful by not presenting such stories as if this animal who resisted, as deserving to be saved. This runs the risk of framing the other animals who didn't manage to escape of not deserving freedom, of it being their own fault that they are sent to slaughter, because all animals deserve freedom. This is also a story of animal resistance that a lot of you probably know about, and this happened in 1994. And this was a 21-year-old elephant named Tik, and she was born in Africa. I don't know in which country specifically, but at a very young age, she was already taken to America to perform in the circus. So you can imagine she had a life of being changed a lot, having the bullhook used to train her, being trained to perform tricks. And we all know what happens when animals are trained to perform tricks. They don't do it naturally, of course. So in 1994, the circus went to Honolulu, Hawaii, and there is actual video footage of this because there were people in the audience filming the show that was going to happen. And at one point, Tik comes running into the circus arena and she starts trampling one of the trainers, and who eventually was killed, and then another one was severely wounded as well. And then at one point she realizes, oh, okay, this is not going to end well for myself, and she really runs. She looks for the exit and she runs out of the tent and slams a fence. This is where you can see when she's slamming the fence of the circus enclosure, and she runs onto the street. Now, by that time, the police was rounded up, and this is Tik running through the streets in Honolulu, Hawaii, and the police was rounded up, of course, and they were chasing her, and it took eventually 86 bullets before she went down, and it's such a sad sight. I rewatched the video some time ago, and it's really hard to watch. And she eventually collapsed in the street, but then even after 86 bullets, she was still alive. And then city zoo officials came to give her a lethal injection, but that still didn't work. And then it took 3 more bullets from the police, and she was killed. Now, this was in 1994, and maybe the older people in the audience will remember this. I remember very well when this was on the news, because even when there wasn't any social media in those days, but this was a story that was picked up by international media, and I think it was on every news channel all over the world. And because it went so viral and it got so much attention, because her story was so touching and a lot of people protested for the use of animals in circuses. So there was massive international protest against the use of wild animals in circuses. And it led eventually to the ban of the use of wild animals in circuses in several cities and countries. And also, because of the resistance of Tik, that was also a starting point that a lot of sanctuaries were set up to give homing to the animals that weren't allowed to perform anymore in circuses. Sorry. Yeah, this is the photo from Tik when she eventually was cornered by the police and shot dead. Now, there are 2 books about animal resistance that really made me change my perspective. On the left, you can see Fear of the Animal Planet by Jason Hribble, and more recently, Animal Resistance in the Global Capitalist Era by Sarah Colling. So if you want to look more into stories of animal resistance, the background, I really recommend you pick up these books. So in our activism, I think we should highlight more the stories of animal resistance to put the focus on their agency, and that is one way to go beyond human saviorism. Now, what is human saviorism, or what is saviorism in general? The term is perhaps better known when used in the context of white saviorism. First, I will give some examples of white saviorism and able saviorism, so you get an idea. This image is a screenshot from a video about the white savior complex made by Radiate and the satirical Instagram account Barbie Savior. Just give me a moment, please. They explain how photos of white Western persons traveling to a far distant country and taking a selfie among children and placing themselves in the middle of the picture and presenting themselves as the main character of the story are examples of white saviorism. and how such photos can rob subjects of their agency, their dignity and privacy, and how they really lack any context. For many people, such social media reports are the main source of knowing about these parts of the world, and they often show stereotypes, oversimplifications of the truth, and focus mainly on the negative aspects of living there. These accounts also often exclude local people working in political organizations, NGOs, and so forth. So Radiate made a social media guide for volunteers following 4 principles. And here you can see the 4 principles. I'm mentioning these principles here as they are just as important in animal rights activism, I think. So promote dignity, gain informed consent, question your intentions, and use your chance to bring down stereotypes when you post. And based on these principles, they made a checklist with things to consider before posting on social media. For example, don't portray yourself as the hero. Question your intentions before posting. Avoid generalizations. Include background information or context and gain informed consent from the persons in the picture. Now, Radiate is the same organization that made a satirical campaign and music video, Africa for Norway, in which Africans call on people to donate radiators, yes, really, radiators for people in Norway because they are suffering from the cold. And if you get a chance to watch it, it's really funny. So that music video in which they call to donate radiators, it's made in the similar style like music videos like We Are the World from the mid-80s, so maybe you know that as well. And they made other great satirical videos like Who Wants to Be a Volunteer?, mocking the white saviorist volunteerism in African countries. Another example of white saviorism, this is a Facebook post made by a sheriff's department in the US. It recounts how they responded to a call regarding an unwanted guest begging for money at a gas station. Turned out it was a homeless person and he had carpet tied to each foot to function as shoes. So they gave him an old pair of boots that they had in the truck, and reportedly, as it is written in that post, the guy instantly put on a big smile on his face, and then the caption says, "So it goes to show we're not all bad guys." Accompanied so by a photo of the officer or sheriff and the person who received the $200 old shoes. Note that they also had to include the fact that the shoes originally cost $200. Now in all the comments you can see the officers are thanked for their kindness. So this post is totally centered around the do-gooder, and it really reeks of virtue signaling, while foregoing the systemic context, like how police officers are there to enforce a system in the first place, leading to homelessness. Now, white saviorism, of course, not only manifests itself on an individual level, but it's also institutionalized. So a couple of months ago, the G7 countries announced that they would be donating 1 billion COVID vaccines doses to other countries, described as developing countries, poor countries, struggling countries, in several media reports. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that vaccinating the world would show the benefits of the G7's democratic values. While at the same time, those poorer or developing countries are struggling to pay off their debts, and patents for the vaccines remain in place so that others cannot manufacture the vaccines themselves. In the same line, think of how modern-day philanthropy, especially elite philanthropy, with power concentrated in the hands of mega foundations and prestige charity foundations, reinforces the power of the rich and perpetuates inequalities rather than remedies them. It does little to address the underlying causes of inequality, but it provides benefits to the proponents by attributing them social and political esteem or reputation. Charity in this way can also be a way for the rich to pay lower taxes. This is a screenshot from the Barbie Savior Instagram page, which I mentioned earlier. Now, Barbie Savior, it's a satirical page about white saviorism and volunteerism, which refers to the combination of tourism on the one hand and volunteer work on the other hand. The volunteerism industry is, in fact, a multi-billion-dollar industry, shifting resources away from the local community towards providing food and accommodation for the tourist volunteers. The expenses for traveling to these places alone are resources that could be very useful for local activists and organizations, not to mention the environmental costs of flying to the other side of the world. Now, there are many similar examples when it comes to able saviorism, both on an individual and on an institutional level. I will be only giving 2 examples. So there are many films and TV shows that use an able savior trope, where the person with a disability is seen as lesser, and the able-bodied person is the hero of the story. The plot is often focused on saving the disabled person from their miserable life, because, of course, disabled people cannot save themselves, and they lead miserable lives. And only able people can save them, of course. That is, if they need to be saved at all in the first place. This is a screenshot from The Greatest Showman. And now, in this movie, P.T. Barnum is presented as an able-bodied savior, which really does not correspond to the man who in real life exploited the disabled persons performing in his circus. The movie is criticized for romanticizing the story of Barnum, who had disabled people perform in so-called freak shows, together with animals other than humans who were forced to perform tricks in his circus. So here's the overlap as well. The story also completely erases disabled agency in favor of situating Barnum as the able-bodied representative of the disabled. Note that also movies in which disability is a storyline often portray a message that disability can only be identified, promoted, and fixed by a white able-bodied savior. Another example is when able-bodied people are congratulated or applauded for spending time with disabled people or for giving them presents, or for including them in a normal everyday activity. This was a post on Twitter and Instagram in which a schoolboy posted a video of him giving a toy truck to a disabled boy as a Christmas present. Heavily applauded, but on the other hand also criticized for being an able savior trope. Would he also post this when giving a present to a non-disabled friend? Although it's really a well-meaning gesture, it is striking that an able person is so applauded for just helping a disabled person. And in such incidences, there is often benevolent ableism involved. There are certainly positive intentions of the perpetrators, and they are trying to help, and maybe they don't know better, but disabled people are treated as being lesser, as deserving pity, and as such, it is actually reinforcing ableism. Now, how can we recognize saviorism? What are the characteristics of saviorism? And I will turn to animal activism in a minute. But first, some general pointers that can serve as red flags for saviorism. Being self-serving or self-centering. Help is often offered in a self-serving manner. Think of charities that use disabled bodies to gain social status or capital. It is about the savior, the do-gooder. They are the protagonist of the story, showing to the world how good they are and expecting praise and gratitude in return. They center themselves in the story. It has a narcissistic component and makes the helper feel good about themselves. Often it is doing more for the do-gooder than the people they are trying to help. The people in need, the oppressed groups, are just background props for do-gooder humans. Charity work can support a feeling of being happy about one's own life and that one doesn't belong to the oppressed group, nurturing the feeling that one is better off, that one is privileged. It is a way for those with institutionalized privilege to feel good about themselves. Another characteristic, knowing better. One recurring theme is that saviors pretend that they know better or actually really think that they know better than the groups they are saving. They are the only ones who can help, and they are saving these people from themselves, because, as it's put, they don't know any better. This is also done without hearing the direct experiences from those who are helped. The savior is not open to input from those they want to help. There's no consultation of them. The saviors remain in charge. And it's not only knowing better, but also an actual belief of being better than the people who are being saved or rescued, and as such perpetuating a discriminatory belief. Erasing the voices of the helped. Saviors not only don't listen to the voices and experiences of oppressed groups, they also erase them. They think they are giving a voice to the oppressed when in fact they are the ones who have stolen or contribute to the silencing of the voices of the oppressed groups. Often the work of local communities or work from local organizations who are embedded in these societies is ignored or erased. And consent is also an issue that should be considered here. For example, when posting photos that include people who are helped. like disabled people, people in developing nations. Have they really consented to be pictured in that situation? What about their dignity? No systemic solutions. Often the belief is held that problems can be solved by individuals. The work or activism is not addressing structural problems, not tackling systemic oppression. It fails to address the systemic barriers and offers no long-term solutions. This is sometimes also referred to as the charity trap. Charity organizations that are set up to deal with the inequalities and other problems that high-profile proponents actually cause and create. And at the same time, they perpetuate those problems and they don't address the root causes. These charities are founded for the benefit of the oppressed, marginalized, but they are often perpetuating a discriminatory ideology, preventing the empowerment of oppressed groups. This is not saying that all charity work focusing on the short term or with a single issue focus is bad, of course. It is, of course, also needed. And as the organization No White Saviors also said, we never said no white people. We just know you shouldn't be the hero of the story. So saviorism subtly reinforces deeply rooted hierarchies, stereotypes, and oppression as a result of colonialism, patriarchy, and imperialism. And that savior mentality reinforces the concept that there are inferior communities in the world who need to be saved by white enabled ideologies, technologies, or leadership. Here is a quote from author and novelist Teju Cole, who coined the term white savior industrial complex in 2012. The white savior industrial complex is not about justice, it's about having a big emotional experience that validates privilege. So in sum, why is saviorism wrong? So it confirms or consolidates the hierarchy, the discrimination and oppression it tries to alleviate. It strips oppressed groups from their agency. And what about the effectiveness in bringing change? So maybe there is change on the short term, but it doesn't really address the much needed structural change. Now, human saviorism. So what about the animal rights movement? Is there saviorism there? Is there what I think we can call human saviorism? This is a photo from a well-known activist posing inside a slaughterhouse in Bali. Now, I blurred out the faces also in following slides, as I don't want this to be about calling out individual activists, so that's why I blurred the faces and the names. This photo, and I think a lot of you will have seen this photo, has sparked a lot of discussion, especially about why the activist included himself in the picture. He answered it was for strategic reasons, for effectiveness, and replied, "It's how social media works. More people will be influenced if I include myself in the picture," he says. "It's not narcissism, it's strategy." Now, effectiveness, I think, seems to have become somewhat of an easily used container word to justify just about any campaign or any type of activism. How is effectiveness measured here? By the number of likes or interaction on social media. And on a side note, we could also say a lot about how clicktivism has a saviorist component. Do more likes and comments mean many non-vegans are exposed to a vegan message and are going vegan, taking on a non-speciesist stance? Or does it primarily echo with the already vegans? And what about the deontological aspects? I know we have to be careful with making analogies, but suppose a human would pose like this in a setting where members of an oppressed group of humans are exploited. Would this be accepted as strategic or effective? Consider some of the slogans that we use in campaigns in our activism. Vegans or animal rights activists like to present themselves as being vegan for the voiceless or a voice for the voiceless. But other animals are not voiceless. And presenting them as voiceless frames them as passive recipients, as having no agency. There's a quote from Arundhati Roy that's very fitting here. There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. Now, the reply I often get when I address this issue of voiceless and not calling other animals voiceless is that the term voiceless is used metaphorically. That, of course, yes, animals do have a voice, they communicate, they have their own language, but the term is only used metaphorically. But even when it is used metaphorically, it permeates a speciesist mind frame. And this is a quote from Sunara Taylor here from the book Beasts of Burden. When animal advocates describe animals as voiceless, even when it is meant simply as a metaphor, it gives power to those who want to view animals as simply mindless objects. So other animals do have voices, and we should bring their voices into the conversation. We should amplify their voices. We should center the stories and the voices of animals and not present ourselves as the saviors of other animals, but as their allies, as their supporters. They do have agency, and they do resist their oppression. So this is where the stories of animal resistance can play an important role. We should recognize and acknowledge the role of other animals themselves, that the other animals themselves play in their liberation and how they fight against oppression. They are not passive recipients, subjects, waiting to be saved, rescued, and liberated by humans, but they actively resist their use and abuse themselves. And I think their own role and their agency, their active contribution in their own liberation struggle has been mainly overlooked in animal advocacy. Now, a little bit more about human saviorism. Another example which may be indicative of human saviorism is the rhetoric of saving the environment, or as I already mentioned, saving animals. This is often stated in conservationist circles or environmental campaigns that we should be saving the rainforest, saving the oceans, or we are saving species from extinction. I think this is pretty ironic as we are on the brink of an ecological disaster and collapse caused by the actions of humans, of us ourselves. We are all but saving them, but contributing to their demise. The rainforest doesn't need saving, it needs to be left alone. Consider also the hero worshipping in animal rights activism. I'm going to quickly show another couple of examples as I'm near the end of my time. This was a post portraying a well-known vegan activist as Jesus, actually the savior. And this was a poster with the faces from well-known animal rights activists based on the movie poster of The Avengers, the superhero movie from 2012. I first thought this was a parody, but apparently it was made as a sincere tribute to these activists. And similarly to parody accounts denouncing white saviorism, like the ones I showed in the beginning, Barbie Savior, there are also some platforms that take issue with human saviorism, like the Ken Savior and Karen Savior platforms. These are pages on Facebook. So this is a post from one of them parodying animal rights activism who travel the world and mainly photograph themselves. Note that there are also analogies to be made of doing animal rights activism in so-called exotic places in the world and the voluntourism that I mentioned earlier. Now, rounding up about human saviorism, these were some key elements to recognize saviorism. Self-serving or self-centering, which does happen in animal activism, making it about the activist or even the organization and not the other animals who are oppressed and exploited. The focus is more on the role of the human saviors than on the liberatory struggle of other animals. But it's not about us, or it shouldn't be about us, but about the animals. Knowing better. I think this is a difficult one. As we are living in a highly industrialized, urbanized world, there are so few spaces left for other animals to live naturally without human interference. And in some cases, yes, we simply do know better as we have disturbed or destroyed the abilities of other animals to simply live their life unaided, for example, to acquire migration route information from their ancestors, or to simply live without human interference, as is the case with many domesticated species. Think of how the Belgian blue cows cannot give birth naturally anymore because mostly they need a cesarean section. Ideally, they should be left alone, but there are few places left for them to be left alone. Spaces like Chernobyl, quite ironically really, can learn us a lot about the reclaiming forces of nature. Erasing their voices. This happens a lot, linguistically, for example, with calling ourselves voices for the voiceless. Stripping other animals of their agency when presenting them solely as victims needing to be saved, and not taking into account their resistance against oppression. And in doing so, maybe implicitly or unknowingly consolidating a speciesist mind frame. Now, the issue of consent, which I mentioned before, I think that is a really difficult one when it is applied to relations between humans and other animals, and we could debate about that philosophically. It's a difficult issue, but it should not simply be brushed off the table, but I won't go any further into it here. No systemic solutions. So this is obviously evident in animal welfarist activism, which doesn't question the system as such, but only offers welfare improvements while still exploiting the animals. And also single-issue activism, reducitarianism, Meatless Monday or Thursday Veggie Day campaigns, but further also vegan lifestyle activism, consumerist veganism, often lacks any system critique. They focus solely on changing individual behavior, but they miss context, the need for structural change. We need systemic solutions to speciesism, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism. We need to challenge the animal-industrial complex. And buying a plant-based burger at Burger King will not achieve that. Animals first, or all for animals activism, with a focus solely on animal liberation, often misses the crucial understanding of the interconnectedness of all oppressions, indispensable for achieving total liberation. These can all perhaps be somewhat effective on the short term, I'm not denying that, but they won't bring down the oppressive house. So these were some thoughts about saviorism, applied in the context of animal rights activism, human saviorism, and what we can do to support that and surpass that, and how stories of animal resistance can play a role here. Of course, I would like to stress that not all animal rights or environmental activism has a saviorist approach. And I don't want this to come across as if all individual action or short-term campaigns or such have no value, or that all social media posts that include a photo of an activist are to be dismissed or should be critiqued as saviorism. Of course, that's not the case. But I hope I have raised some questions, though, and hope that it inspires activists to self-reflect about their own activism, as it has been the case for me. Thank you.